Joining us on 710 KURV, we're going to get caught up on foreign policy things, and we're getting caught up with Alex Little, who is incredibly well-versed in many things. He's been everywhere, basically, learning all the languages and going to all the think tanks. He's been at Cato and Heritage and you name it.
So he thinks a lot, right? He thinks a lot.
Yeah, so he's been around with a lot of the big brains there. From Rutgers University, New Brunswick, is Alex Little joining us on 710 KURV. And we're talking about one of your articles that was just recently published a few days ago. And let's talk about the state of foreign policy for a second. So what, from your perspective right now, what is the state of things on the planet?
Sure. So thank you for having me, first of all. So speaking of my article, from my point of view, U.S. foreign policy needs a reevaluation. So when the Biden administration began, it proclaimed that adults are back in charge after the Trump administration in foreign policy specifically. However, the Biden administration, in my mind, deserves criticism as it's made serious missteps in various theaters worldwide, namely in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. So the main error, in my opinion, has been the administration's encouragement of both Israel and Ukraine in chasing maximalist objectives. So for Israel, this entails ousting Hamas from power. And for Ukraine, it means reclaiming all of its internationally recognized territory. So in my piece, my argument was that American involvement in these maximalist pursuits essentially perpetuates violence rather than reduces it. And in my piece, I cite some polling in which Americans broadly agree that they would like to see less military involvement abroad. However, our current foreign policy is entirely detached from the desires of the Americans it's designed to serve. However, the United States has strong examples of effective diplomacy, as mentioned in the piece. I cite President Nixon's normalization of diplomatic relations with China as a breakthrough in U.S.-China relations, and its effect on the balance of power during the Cold War, which greatly favored the United States. And a more recent example I provide is the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, which, from a non-proliferation point of view, was a clear success. Iran's enriched uranium levels have skyrocketed since we left the deal. So I think that the United States is clearly capable of utilizing diplomacy in meeting global challenges. However, diplomacy and the utilization of leverage must be explored more often.
Joining us on 710 KURV is Alex Little. He's got an article in the American Conservative titled, "The Adults Are Not Back in Charge of U.S. Foreign Policy." Davis Rankin, go ahead with your question.
A question about Ukraine. If you were in charge, what would you do, or what would you advise President Biden to do?
Sure. So Ukraine is in a not so great spot right now. Kyiv was in a much better position to negotiate for peace earlier in the conflict, as Kyiv had momentum, but Western powers egged Ukraine on to pursue maximalist objectives, specifically Boris Johnson's the UK. And every day
he wanted to get back all the land that Russia had invaded. He wanted his country back, right?
Correct. However, every day that the Ukraine war drags on, the risk of escalation increases. And so in terms of U.S. involvement in this conflict, the United States needs to avoid the potential for a great power war when its core national interests are not at stake. And so in my view, Ukraine, whether now or months down the line, will need to eventually accept a stance of neutrality. So Ukraine can rebuild its sovereignty and rebuild its infrastructure and eventually become a member of the European Union. So, for instance, countries like Finland, which was invaded by the Soviet Union, after it was invaded, it came to a ceasefire with the Soviet Union in which it conceded a portion of its territory and held a stance of neutrality for many decades. However, during that time, Finland has become a very prosperous nation with a strong sense of nationalism. So in my mind, Ukraine can follow a similar path while saving tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives.
What do you think would happen, since we're in an election year right now, what do you think would happen if we were to move from, or actually, what if Biden wins the election? Let's do this. Let's play the war game, no pun intended, for between if Biden were to win if the Biden administration had 4 more years versus if we got Trump back in 2024. What do you think would be the major comparisons there?
Well, as things stand now, Republicans do not seem to be budging on this Ukraine aid. And moreover, the United States cannot send the ammunition and missiles that the government in Kyiv needs to fend off Russia's invasion. The math is just not there, regardless of who's in power. So, and the next step would be for Europe to step up. However, European officials are also saying that they cannot replace U.S. military aid. So I don't view it more so as who is in power, but what the reality is in terms of our capability to provide what Ukraine needs. I think it's just not there.
We're speaking with Alex Little, who's got a piece in the American Conservative titled "The Adults Are Not Back in Charge of U.S. Foreign Policy." He's our guest on 710 KURV. So who are the adults anyway? And where are these people? Why aren't they running to be in charge?
Bring back Richard Nixon.
He has the disembodied head.
That's a good question. I think that remains to be seen. I think that we, as a country, really need to invest in our diplomats. I think that the State Department has a lot of great capabilities, and we need to empower the next generation of diplomats. So I think that there needs to be a concerted effort there. As I mentioned in my piece, I think there are great examples of great negotiators. For instance, Richard Nixon. During the Obama administration, there were very talented diplomats that crafted the JCPOA. So I think there are great examples for future diplomats to follow. But I think that I have an optimistic view that the United States does have that potential.
What are two of the biggest threats, in your opinion, right now, globally, for the United States, in the state that we're in right now?
I think that China's threat in terms of our economic prosperity in the Pacific is an issue that we should take seriously. The United States should do what it can to avoid a conflict over Taiwan. And in my view, what we're doing in Ukraine is taking away from what we could be doing to aid Taiwan. So up until recently, it's been fairly manageable in terms of what arms we've been providing to Ukraine that overlap with what Taiwan needs. However, as time has gone on, it's become much more of an issue in that Taiwan desperately needs these forms of weapons that we've been giving to Ukraine. And so I think that the United States should pivot to Asia and take the China threat more seriously. Another threat that I think is very significant for the United States is the southern border. I think that the United States should emphasize its own border over the borders of other countries. So I think that issue has just been completely neglected, and we need order at our southern border. So those are the
Did you get an opportunity to
mind.
see the Tucker Carlson Vladimir Putin interview that just came out?
I did. I watched it last night.
He had cited that as one of our big problems that we're not paying attention to as our southern border. That's fascinating to me.
Vladimir Putin said that?
Yeah.
God, irony. He doesn't know the definition of irony, does he? I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm kind of disagreeing with our guest, who's a lovely person, but you can't trust Vladimir Putin for nothing.
Well, I don't have time to encapsulate the 2 hours there, but that statement right there from Putin about our southern border. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that every country should place its own citizens and the safety and prosperity of its own citizens first. I don't think the United States can solve every border dispute, every global problem. And so it doesn't matter to me who says that or not. I think that the principle of the United States preserving its own safety and prosperity is what I would say is most important.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Alex. Appreciate your time here today. Find out who the adults look like by reading the article. The adults are not back in charge of U.S. foreign policy. It's in the American Conservative, theamericanconservative.com. I want to thank Alex Little, our guest today. You're listening to News Talk 710 KURV, your 956 Drive Home.